Now after the sign up page, we want to perform an email verification. So we need an email verification page. For this, we will create another file under the screens and call it email verification. For this as well, we can copy and paste the content of our login page. And now to see the output of this file, we go to the app.js file and import email verification. With that done, we go back to the email verification file. The first thing we do is to change the name of the component to email verification. Now at the very top of the email verification page, we want to display an icon. And for that, we want to create another component to make it very reusable. So for this, under the components directory, we'll create another directory and call it icons. In this icons directory, we'll create a file and call it icon header. For this file, we start by copying the content of the main container. Now we change the name of the component to icon header. Now since this component will be for an icon, we need an icon pack, and we can bring in the icon pack from the style text input. So at the top, we copy the import statement. Now for the styled view, we'll change the name to icon background. And we'll do the same in the component. As the child of the icon background, we'll put the material community icon. To be able to see the progress, let's go to the email verification file and import the icon header. So at the top of the email verification file, we import icon header. Now at the very top, below the keyboard avoiding container, we make use of the icon header. Let's pass it a few properties here. We'll give it a name of lock open. In addition to that, we'll give it a margin at the bottom of 30 pixels. So that will be through the style property. Now we go back to the icon header file to continue our work. Now for the icon background view, we can get rid of all the properties with the exception of the background. For the background, we'll change the color to secondary. It's not here, so we add it to the colors import. Now we set the width of the view, and we want it to be a fraction of the screen height. So we import the screen height from our shared file. So instead of the status bar height, we replace that with screen height. We want the width to be 15%, so you multiply it by 0.15. This will be equivalent to 15% of the screen height. And after that, we add our unit, which is pixels. We want to do a similar thing for the height, so we can copy and paste it. and then we change the property name to height. Now for the border radius as well, we want it to be a fraction of the height, so we can paste what we copied earlier. And now we change the property to border radius. Now for the value, we can change this to 0.2. This will give us the perfect circle that we are going after. Now we add a few more properties to align it to the center. The first one is justify content. And we'll give it a value of center. Also, we need to align the items to the center. And lastly, we need to align the circle itself to the center of the page. So we use align self. Let's fix the spelling of the self. Good. Now in the icon header property, we need to destructure the properties that were passed. So we destructure the name and also the size and the color. After that, we want to spread the remaining properties. Now for the icon background, I don't want to spread all the properties on it. I want to target only the style property. So I'll get rid of this and use the style property instead. Inside the style property, we will spread the received styles from the props. After that, we will pass the name of the icon to the material community icons. For the size of the icon, we can ignore the one here and make use of a fraction of the screen height. So we can copy the one we use for the border radius. This time around, we want it to be 8% of the screen height, so that will be 0.08. Now for the color of the icon, if we receive a color from the properties, we want to use that. Otherwise, we want to set the color to the accent color. So we first make a check for the color. And if it exists, we'll go ahead to use the color. Otherwise, we'll use the accent color. But we don't have the accent color over here, so we need to bring it in. And this should work fine. Now we are done with the icon header, so we can clear the unused properties and then move to the next one. Now let's go back to the email verification page. Right below the icon header, we want to center the text, so we set the text align to the center. And for the value, we will change it to enter the 4-digit code. Now at this point, we need an input field for our code, and for that, we want to create 4 split inputs. So inside the input file, we will create a component for the code input. And for this, we will call it styled code input. So over here in this file, we need to set up a component, and once again, we can copy the main container. Once we've pasted it, we will change the name of the component to styled code input. Also, for the main styled view we have over here, we'll change the name to code input section. This is because it will be used as a container to wrap all our split inputs. Now for the properties, we'll get rid of everything with the exception of the flex. We'll align the items to the center. And also, we'll justify the content to the center. And lastly, we'll give it a margin vertical of 35 pixels. Now what you are going to do is that there is no native way to display split input in React Native. So we are going to use our regular code input field, but whenever an input is entered, we will display a separate view for it. And for the input field, we'll hide it. But we need to be able to select the input field to accept the user input. So for that, we'll make use of the reference attribute for that. I have a whole video about how to set up the split input fields, and it can be found in the playlist in the description. But I'll still go over it in this video to get it done. So for the next step, let's create our input field, and because we'll hide it, we'll call it hidden text input. The component will be the text input component. Now before we continue, let's pass this as the child to the code input section. And also we can get rid of the props over here. Now let's give our text input a few properties. The first one is the keyboard type. For this, we'll set the value to number pad. Also, we want to set a return key type, and that will be done. This return key type refers to the key that is displayed at the bottom right corner of our keyboard. Also, we can set a text content type, and that one will be one-time code. Also, as I said earlier, we want to give this input field a reference. So for that, we need to bring in the useref hook from React. So now in the component, we'll create a text input ref. Making use of the useref hook, we'll pass an initial value of now. Now we pass this variable to the input field via the ref property. So we can just copy and paste it. Now we need to pass a value to the input field and limit the length of input that we want to accept. But for those values, we want to receive them as argument. So let's go back to the email verification file. Over here and at the top of the file, we want to start by declaring the length of the code that we want. Writing the name of the variable this way doesn't change anything. I just prefer the look of this for constants which are numbers. So for the value, we set it as 4. That is, we want to accept only a 4-digit input. Now in addition to that, we need a state to monitor the value of the code input. So we create another state for it. We'll make use of the useState hook and set the initial value to an empty string. Now we need to bring in our code input container and mount it. So we can copy the name and mount it below our regular text. Now we pass the value of the maximum length to it. Also, we pass the code and the set code function. Now we see an error over here, and that is because we added an S to the justify content property. So back in the style code input, we should be able to get rid of the S. So under the code input section, we can get rid of the S. Now it's hard to see, but we should have an input field around here. Now from the props of the style code input, we want to destructure the values that we pass to it. Starting with the code, followed by the set code, and also the maximum length. Now we pass the code to the hidden text input via the value property. Also, to the unchanged text property, we pass the set code. And also to the max length property, we pass our maximum length. Also, when we are done editing the input field, we want to have a handler for that, and that will be through the onSubmit editing property. For the handler, we'll call it handle onSubmit editing. And we don't have it already, so we just declare it and implement it later. Now because we want to display each decade of the input we receive as a separate box, we'll use an array for managing that. So at the top of the component, we'll create an array. We'll call this code decade array. For this, we'll give it a length of our maximum length. And also, to be able to display something even if we don't have a value, we'll fill it with zeros. Now to be able to display the items, we need some more components. So at the top, we'll first create one for input container. This will serve as the physical boundary for the input fields where it can be pressed on and we can start entering some input. Because we want to be able to press this will be a pressable. We want this to take 70% of our screen, so we'll give it a width of 70%. Also, we want all the individual input boxes to be in a row, so we set the flex direction to row. Also, we want to have spaces between each input box, so we justify the content to be spaced between. Now for the actual boxes for each input, those will be views, so we create another component for that. And we'll call this code input. We'll start by giving this a minimum width of 15%. Also, we'll give it a padding of 12 pixels. Now we want to give it a border, so we set the border width to 5 pixels. We give it a border radius of 10 pixels. And also we give it a border color of secondary. Now for the actual digits that will be in the input box, that will be text. So we create another component for that. And we'll call this code input text. For this, we'll start by giving it a font size of 22 pixels. Also, we'll give it a font weight of bold. Now the error here is that we don't have the secondary color, so let's bring it in from our colors. Back to the text, we'll align it to the center. Also, we want to give it a color of tertiary. So for that, we bring it in as well. Done with that, we can go ahead to display our initial boxes. So for that, we'll put our code inputs container just above the hidden text input. Now inside this code input container, we want to display our 4 digits. But to prevent typing this manually 4 times, we want to make use of the map method. And for the map method, we'll pass it a function which returns the input digit. So we'll call the map method on the code digit array. And for the function, we'll call it to code digit input. Now we implement the function just above the return. When you use the map method, you can expect to receive the value and the index of the current item. So we can use those as the parameters. Now if there is nothing available for the current index, that is if you're expecting 4 digits and maybe you have 2 digits, you want to return an empty input character. And that will be a string with white space. So for the actual digit, we'll target the value at the index of the code, or if there is nothing, we'll return our empty input character. Remember, the code is the state that we declared in the email verification file. With that in place, we can return our code input. Now we need to provide this with a key, so we set the value to the index. In this, we can make use of our code input text. And for the value, we'll pass the digits we have over here. Now to be able to receive a response when we press on the input fields, we need an onPress property on our input container. So we pass 1 to it. We'll call this function handle onPress. Let's move this function up to where we have the handle on submit editing. Now when our input container is pressed, what we want to do is that we want to focus on the input field, which is targeted by the text input reference here. So calling on the current property will refer to the text input. That is the hidden text input we have over here. So once we have that, we want to call the focus method. Now when we press on the code input, the keyboard should pop up. And now we can start typing something. But as you can see, we have our actual text input here. That is because we've not hidden it yet. So to do that, we go back to the hidden text input and provide some properties. We start by positioning it to be absolute. And also, we give it a width and a height of 1 pixel. Finally, we give it an opacity of 0. You can also set the height and the width to be 0 pixels, but sometimes when you do that, the reference works no more. Now whenever we are entering something into the input fields, we want the current one to be highlighted, so we'll create a component for that. So for that, it will be similar to the code input. We'll call this code input focused. Now for the inputs, the look we are going for here is for the border to be just at the bottom. So we can change the border width property here to point just to the bottom. And now for when our input is in focus, we can change the border color to highlight it. For this, we change the color to our accent color. Since we don't have it here, we need to bring it from our colors. Now to be able to apply the focused code input, we first need to know whether the input field has been clicked on at all. And for that, we need a state. So we bring in the useState tool from React. And just below the codegate array, we can create our state. We'll call this state input container is focused. And then we set the value of the input container is focused. This will have an initial value of false. Now we'll set the value of this state whenever we press on the input field or we are done editing. So for when we press on the input field, we'll set this value to true. Now we can copy this and use it in the handle on submit editing. Over here, we want to set the value to false. Now that we know if our input field has been clicked on or not, we need to be able to determine the current decade to highlight. So for that, we need to make a few more checks in the toCodeDecade_input function. These checks will help us do the formatting. The first thing we want to know is that is the current index in the map referring to the actual current decade in our code. And for this situation, It will be true when the index of the map is the same as the length of our code. Secondly, we want to know if we are having the last digit. And for this to be true, the index of the map should be the same as the maximum length minus 1. Next, we need to know whether our code is full. That is, we are not accepting any other input again. For this to be true, the length of our code needs to be equal to our maximum length. Now, based on these three situations, we want to determine whether a digit is focused. So for a digit to be focused, first, it should be the current digit. That is the first condition. Or this digit should be the last digit and our code should be full. When this condition is true, that means we have a digit focused. Now based on this, we want to alternate our code input we have over here. So for that, we'll create a variable for it and call it styled code input. For this, we'll first check whether the code input is in focus at all. That is, we'll use the state we created over here. After that, we want to know whether the digit is in focus. That is the one we just created here. If that is true, we want to return the focused code input. That is the component we created over here. Otherwise, we want to return the regular code input. With that done, what we need to do is that we replace the code input here with the styled code input. Now when we click on the code input, this should take effect. Now the last thing we'll do in this file is that when we have all the digits that we want to toggle a state. We'll use this state later on to enable or disable a button. So for the state, we'll first declare it in the email verification file. Just below the state we have already, we'll declare the state. We'll call this pin ready. The initial value of this will be false. Now I want to pass this setPin function to the code input. Now back in the styled code input, we'll destructure this property from the props. Now to be able to set this value, we want to monitor the code input field whenever the value changes. And to be able to make this continuous monitoring, we need to use the useEffect hook. So we import that from React. Now just before the toCode input, we can put our useEffect hook. This will first take a function. And the second argument will be an array. Now inside the first argument, which is the function, we want to make our toggling. Looks like my app has lost the connection with the server, so I'll just refresh it. Now we want to set the pin ready to the comparison between the code length and the maximum length that we expect. This should give us the value that we want. Also after that is when the component on mount and we are no longer on this page, we want to set pin ready to false. And that will be inside the return function. Now we want this update to happen whenever the code value changes. So to ensure that, we'll put the code value inside the array we have over here. And that should do it for this component. Now back on the email verification page, we start work on our button. So just below the code input here, we want to have a button. Now we can cut the buttons from the former components over here. Apart from that, we don't need anything here, so we can get rid of the former component. Now below the styled code input, I'll paste the buttons. Now I'll make a few changes. The first one is that we need an extra state for verifying. So we go to the top and create it. The initial value of this will be set to false. Now back to where we have our buttons, we'll change the submitting property to verifying. Now for the activity indicator button, it is fine, but for the other one, we need to still make some changes. So for the content of it, we will change the value to verify. Also for the onPress attribute, we'll change the function to handle email verification. We'll just declare the function and implement it later. Actually, we can just update the handle login function and work with it later. Now for the button, in addition to checking for verifying, we want to also check for whether the pin is ready. So if verifying is false and the pin is ready, we want to return our button. In the situation where the verifying is false and also the pin is not ready, we want to display the button, but it will be disabled. So we can copy and paste this. So we disable the pin ready and we can get rid of the onPress property. In that situation, we first pass the disabled property. Also, we want to style it differently, so we pass the style. In this case, we want to set the background color to the secondary color. We don't have it here yet, so we import it. But for now, let's proceed. The next thing we want to do is that we want to change the color of the text. So for that, we'll do it through the text style. In that case, we want to change the color to light gray. Now we don't have both colors here, so we go to the top and import them. So import the secondary color and the light gray color. This should give us the look that we are going after. Now when we are on this page, it means we are expecting the user to receive an email and provide us with a value. But in a situation where the user doesn't receive the value, we want to provide an option for the user to request for the pin to be resent. And for that feature, we want to attach a timer to it so that the user will have a limited number of resend requests in a particular time. So to do that, we will create a component and call it Resend Timer. But we'll create it under the directory of timers under component. In this file, we copy and paste our main container. And we change the name of the component to Resend Timer. To start, let's import the small test component so that we'll use it to give us an idea of what we want to achieve. So inside the styled view, we make use of the small text. We need another one, so we copy and paste it. The second one will be to display the time. So the idea is that the resend that we have over here will be a pressable text. And also the 30 that we have over here will be a dynamic value which keeps on changing. To see the output of this, let's import the Resend Timer on the email verification page. And then we can use this just below our buttons. Now before we go back to the Resend Timer, we want to create one state for it. So at the top, we go to where we have our states and copy and paste one of them. For this state, we will call it Active Resend. And the initial value will be false. Active Resend in the sense that when our timer is running, we want our Resend button to be disabled. So whenever our timer is still running, Active Resend will be false. And when it is done running, Active Resend will be true. We'll need some other states, but we'll add to them when we progress. So back in the Resend Timer file, we bring in the Active Resend from the props. And we'll spread the other props in addition. Now for the styled view, we'll clear all the style and just align the content to the center. Now focusing on the time first, we'll need a function to trigger a timer. We'll call this function trigger timer. This function will expect to receive a target time in seconds. So that will be the parameter. We'll give this parameter a default value of 30. Now to hop this function, we need some extra states here. The first one will be the time left. That is, if we trigger the timer and as the time proceeds, we want to update the time left. So for this, we will need the useState hook here. So we import it from React. So we'll call this time left. For the initial value, we'll set it to null. Also, for our target time, we want to create a state for it. Now when we enter our trigger timer function, the first thing we want to do is to set the time received as our target time. Once we have that, since we are triggering our timer, we want to set active resend to false. So we need the set function for the active resend as well. So we destructure it here and go back and add it in the email verification file. So back on the email verification page, we add the active resend to the pass properties. Looks like I didn't pass any of them, so I'll pass both the active resend and the set active resend. Now we can go back to the resend timer. Now once we are done setting the active resend to false, we want to convert the time into a date. This will enable us to be able to implement the timer easily. So by converting the time to date, we'll call this final time. And over here, we'll call the date object to return the current date and time. For this, we want to work with the value in milliseconds, so we can precede the new here with a plus to convert this to integer. Now after this, we want to add our target time in seconds. But since we are receiving our time in seconds, we need to multiply it by 1000 to convert it to milliseconds. With that done, we need to set an interval and calculate our time left every 1 second. So for that, I'll declare a variable and call it Resend Timer Interval. And for the value, I'll set it to the set interval function. The first argument to be a function, and we'll call this function calculate time left. And as an argument, we'll pass the final time. And for this function, we want to call it every second, so we'll pass 1000 milliseconds to it. Now just below the trigger timer, we can create our calculate time left. And this expects the final time. Now how we calculate the final time is that we'll check for the difference between the final time we received and the current time. In this case, we made use of date here, so we'll compare the final time to the current date in milliseconds. So we'll create a variable and call it difference. And this will be the difference between the final time and then the current date. Once again, we'll precede this with a plus to convert this to integer. Now once we have our difference, we will check if the difference is greater than 0. If the difference is greater than 0, then it means that our final time has not been reached yet. So in this case, we want to set the time left to the difference. But because this difference will be in milliseconds, we want to divide it by 1000 to convert it to seconds. Now this value can result in a decimal value, so make use of the math.run method to convert this to an integer. Now in a situation where we don't have a difference greater or equal to 0, that is in the else block, it means that our timer is over. So for that, we'll first clear our interval. And that will be the resend timer interval. Right after that, we want to set active resend to true. And lastly, we want to set our time left to null. Now whenever our component mount, that is whenever we visit this verification page, we want to start the timer. So to do that, we make use of the use effect hook. This we will get from React Native. So just below the calculate time left, we will call the use effect hook. Inside the first argument, which is the function, we will trigger the timer. And for the initial value, we expect to receive this from the component props. So we pass target time in seconds. And we'll make sure that we destructure this from the props. Now when we are done with this page and we move to the next page, we want to clear the interval. So we'll do that by returning a function. And in this function, we'll call clear interval. This will be similar to what we did over here. And also for the second argument of the use effect hook, we'll put an empty array. Now to see our time, we'll place the 30 here with the time left. Now over here, when you have nothing for the time left, we want to fall back to our target time. Now just for the time part of the text, we want to make it bold. So wrap it in another small text and style it. We'll style it by giving it a font weight property of bold. Now the last thing we'll do for this guy is that we want this timer to be displayed only when active resend is false. If that is not the case, this in 30 seconds will be displayed every time, but we don't want that. So wrap all this in the active resend condition. Now moving to the top, we said we want this resend to be a button. So for that, we'll bring in the pressable text. Once we have that, we want to wrap the resend with the pressable text. And for this one, we'll do it outside the small text component. You can just cut and paste it there. Now since this is a button, it requires an onPressed property. For the value, we expect to receive a resend email function from the email verification file. So for that, we can destructure it from the props. Once we have that, we can pass it to the onPressed property. But when we call this resend email function, we want to give it the ability to trigger the timer once it finishes. So we'll pass the trigger timer function as an argument. And to do that properly, we'll convert this to a function. And as an argument to the resend email, we'll pass trigger timer. Yeah, just like so. Now for the actual resend text that we have over here, we want to be able to change it. That is, when you press on the resend text once, we want to change the value to an activity indicator. Also, when the resend is sent successfully, we want to change the text to sent. And when it fails, we want to change it to failed. So to be able to do that, you have to make the text a state variable. And once again, we want to receive this from the email verification file. So that will be a property. We'll call this resend status. Now once we have the text changing like that, when we have the sent value, we want to change the color to green. And when we receive the field, we want to change the color to red. So for that, let's create a small component for it. And we'll call it resend text. And we want to base this component on the small text component. The first property we want to set is the color. That will be the default color. We'll set this to the accent color. We don't have that yet, so we copy and paste it in the import. After that, we need to make a check for the resend status. So when we use it, we'll pass the resend status to this as a property. So let's go below the colors and accept our properties. So this will take a function where the parameter is the props. Now in the body of the function, we can destructure the resend status from the props. When our resend status is filled, we want to return a color of fill. So we can copy and paste it. You have to ensure that this is the same value that we use when we go back to the email verification file. So if this is the case, we return a string. And the value will be color. And it will pass the fill color. Else if this is not the situation, we return the success color. So we can copy and paste it. We don't have these colors here yet, so we add them to the import. Now back to our test, we make use of the resend text. So in between the pressable text, we'll put our resend text. And for the value, we'll put the resend status. Also, we pass the resend status as a property. Now we are getting an error over here, and this is probably because of something we did in the resend test component. So let's go back there and check it. Okay, coming back to it, we see that in the if statement, we we have double parentheses, so we can get rid of one of them. And also for the condition, I forgot to use double equal sign. Doing that, we should be good. Now we are seeing nothing here because the content has not been passed yet. So let's go back to the email verification file and do that. So back in the email verification file, we want to declare the states. Just after the active resend, we want to do that. So we can copy and paste this state. The next one we'll add is resend status. And for the value, we'll set it to resend. Now when we are done with everything and you press on the resend, we want a state to monitor whether an activity is going on. So we'll create another state and call it resending email. So for that, we can copy and paste this as well. And for the value of this, the initial one will be false. Now we can pass the state values to our resend timer. So we scroll down and pass it to it. So we pass the resend status. Resend status. We pass the resending email. The last thing we'll pass is the resend email function, but we'll come back and handle it later. So let's go back to the resend timer. Now this color here is not supposed to be green. So in the second condition, we want to check if actually the resend status equals sent. And we see that our color is back to what we want it to be. Now let's go back to our test and do a few styling. In the situation where our button is disabled, that is when the timer is still running, we want to pass a disabled property. So for that, we pass it to the pressable text. And for the value, we'll negate the active resend. So this means that when active resend is true, disabled will be false. Also, to make sure that we see that the button is disabled, let's style it. So we pass a style property. For this, we'll make use of opacity. For the value of the opacity, if active resend is false, we want to reduce the opacity. Otherwise, we want to set the opacity to 1. So we can change it to something like 0.65. And when it is true, we want to set the opacity to 1. Now as we can see, the opacity of the text is down. We can further reduce it if we don't like the look of it. Now initially, when we implemented this, we had this text on the same line, but after bringing in the pressable, it moved to the next line. So to get it back in our former condition, let's bring in our row container that we created. So we import the row container component. Now we go down here and wrap the small text and the pressable text in the row container. Once we do that, it should be back on the same line. Now once we are done with that, we can go to the top and clear any unused imports. In this case, that is our status bar height and also the primary color. And this should conclude it for the resend timer file. So let's go back to the email verification file and continue. What we want to do now is to create a function for the resend email. So at the top here, we'll create one just above the handle email verification. We'll call it resend email. And we want this to be an async function. And if you remember, when we called this in the resend timer, we passed the trigger timer function. So we'll take that in as a parameter. Now in this, we can open a try catch block. Now in the try block, when we first enter here, the first thing we want to do is to set resending email to true. Resending email. This will inform us that we are in the process of resending the email. Right after that, we make the request to the backend that we have. And when we are done, we want to update the resend status value. We can set this to be filled or sent, so we can comment this. This should be exactly as we used in the resend timer. Once we are done with that, we can set resending email to false since we are done. And at this point, our content of the resend button will be either filled or sent. So we want to hold on a bit and then we can revert that back to resend. So to do that, we make use of the set timeout function. In the function, the first thing we'll do is to set resend status to resend. This should be just as we did initially. After that, we want to set active resend to false. And also after that, we want to trigger the timer. Now I want to call this in about 5 seconds after we are able to resend the email. So that will be 5,000 milliseconds. Now in the situation where we have an error, we need to handle it. For now, we don't have any message box here, so we can make use of the alert. But first, we need to set our resend status to filled. Also before that, we need to set resending email to false. And once we are done with that, we can alert some message. And we can concatenate the actual message from the error. This should do it for the resend email. Now what we have to do is to pass this to the resend timer. Now at this point, we move to the next thing we want to create, but I'll still be on the verification page. What we want to create is a message modal. That is when we are able to enter the pin that was sent to our email and we press on verify and everything is correct. We want a modal pop-up which will tell the user that the email has been verified and the person can move on to the next page. So that's what we are going to create. So for this, we'll go to our component and create a directory for modals. We will need more than one modal in our work. The first one we'll create is the message modal. Once again, we can copy our main container and paste it here. The first thing we'll do is to change the name of the component to message modal. Now we need the modal component from React Native, so let's import that. Now in the message modal component, we return this as the first component. We'll provide this a property of animation type. And for the value, we'll set this to slide. Also, this requires a visible property. This value will be toggled when we need to show the modal or hide it, but since we are working on it now, we'll set the value to true. Also, we'll pass a transparent value. And for this as well, the value will be true. Now before we proceed, let's go back to the email verification so that we can show the modal and monitor our progress. So back on the email verification page, we import our message modal. So we scroll to the bottom of the page below our resend timer and put our message modal. For now, we will not pass any properties. Now we go back to the message modal component to continue. The next thing we need is a container inside the modal component, and for that, we will build on the styled view we have over here. So we change the name to modal pressable container. Modal pressable container because we want the outside part of the modal to be pressable. So once we press on the outside of the modal, we want to be able to perform some actions including dismissing the modal. So for this, instead of the view, it will be a pressable. Now we'll keep the flex and the padding and we get rid of the padding top. For the background color, we want to change it to something translucent. So instead of our primary color, we'll make use of the RGBA black and give it an opacity of 0.7. So the triple zeros refer to the black and the 0.7 is the opacity. Now make use of this component inside the modal so we can copy the name. And as you can see, it has taken effect on our page. Now because this is a pressable, we expect to receive a function which will handle the onPress attribute. So for that, we'll receive it from the props and we'll call this button handler. Once we have that, we pass it to the modal pressable container. Now inside our pressable container, we want to have a view for the modal content itself. So for that, we create another styled component. We'll call this modal view. For this, we'll give it a background color of primary. Also, we'll give it a border radius of 20 pixels. To see it taking shape, let's put it in the modal pressable container. We'll give this a width of 100%. and we'll give it a padding of 35 pixels. 35 instead. We also align the items in it to the center. Also, we want to give it some border shadow. On Android, we have to use the elevation property. And we'll give it a value of 5. It's very subtle and a bit hard to see, but we want to put it there. After that, for the shadow to be able to work on iOS, we need to add some more properties. The first one is a shadow color. And we'll set this to our black color. For the black color, we'll get it from our colors. Also, we need to give it a shadow offset. And for that, we'll give it a pair of values. The first one is 0 pixel. And the second is 2 pixels. After that, we need a shadow opacity. And then that will be 0.25. And lastly, we'll give it a shadow radius. And that will be 4 pixels. We need all these values for the shadow on iOS to work. Now I want this modal view to be in the center. So in the modal pressable container, we justify the content to the center. Also, we align the items to the center. Now at the very top of the modal, I want to make use of an icon, and we'll get that from the icon pack we've been using all this while. So for that, we can get it from the text input component. At the top, we'll copy the material community icons. Now back in the message modal, we paste this at the top. Now we copy the name of the icon and go back to the modal view. Inside the modal view, we'll paste this. For the name of the icon, we want to toggle between the check icon and the close or wrong icon. So to be able to toggle this, we'll base our check on a type property, and that's the property that we receive from the modal props. So we add it to the properties that we received. We expect this to have a value of success or fail. So if the value equals success, we'll return our check icon. The name of our icon is check circle. Otherwise, we want to return our wrong icon, and the name of that icon is closed circle. We also give our icon a size, and for that, we'll set it to 100. Also, we will need a color for the icon. And once again, we'll toggle between green and red based on the type. So we can copy the name property over here. And then we'll paste it after the size. Now we'll change the property to color. And for the value, if the type is access, we change this to success. That's our green color. Otherwise, you make use of fill. Now we can go to the top and bring in our colors. And that should work on the modal. Now right after that, we want to display some text. And the first one will be a big text. So for that, we import our big text component. So in the modal view, below the icon, we'll put our big text. This will be the heading of the modal. We want to style it a bit more differently, so we pass the style property. We want to change the font size to 25 pixels. In addition to that, we want to set the color to the tertiary color. Also, we don't have it here, so we have to bring it in. In addition to that, we want to give it a margin vertical of 10 pixels. After this, we want to display another text, but this time around, it will be a regular text. So let's bring in our regular text. So below the big text, we use our regular text. The content of this text will be our message. That is, when you have a heading, you also need a message to tell the user what happened. For this, we'll just style it by giving it a margin at the bottom. So through the style property, we'll give it a margin at the bottom of 20. Right after that, we need a button that the user will press on. So for that, we'll bring in our regular button. So below this, we put our regular button. And this button will say something like complete. Now, to make our modal reusable just like how we want it to be, the message property here, the heading, and even the text content of the button, we can take them as properties. So from the properties, we'll structure a header text. That will be the heading. And we'll structure a message. And also we can structure a button text. Now for the content of the big text, we replace it with the header text. And also for the message, we replace it with the message. Also for the content of the button text, we want to toggle between the one we receive and the complete over here. So wrap this in a bracket. And this will be a string. So the first value will be button text. And then we'll fall back to this. So now we have nothing here, but once we actually use it, we'll have some content. Now the next thing we need to handle is the visibility. For this, we want to also receive it as a property. So for that one, we'll call it modal visible. And this value will be passed to the visible property. And this will ensure that we can control the visibility of the modal from outside this component. Now at the top, we check for all the things we didn't use and we get rid of them. In this case, it's only the status bar height. Now we can go back to the email verification page. Now at this point, we need to find a way to provide values for all the props that we destructured in the message modal. I mean these props. The props that we have over here. So we can copy them and ensure that we have a value for each of them. So the easiest way we can provide values for this is to make use of states. So we go to the top of this email verification file and make use of the useState hook. Just below the resending email section, we'll create another section for the modal. And we can paste the values here for reference. Let's comment them out. The first state we need is the modal visible. And for the initial value, we'll set it to false. So we want our modal to be hidden the first time we come to this page. Secondly, we want to handle the type, and for this, we'll call it modal message type. For the initial value, we just set it to an empty string. The next state will be the header text. For this as well, the initial value will be an empty string. Now we need to handle the message and the button text. They'll be very similar to this. We can just copy and paste. Let's copy the message, paste it, and then paste it here as well. The initial value will be the same. Looks like we are having a conflict, so for this we'll change the name to Modal message. And for the last one, that will be the button text. Now what we have left is the button handler. For this it will be a function. Now in this button, what we want to do is that we want to check for the type of the message. If the type of the message is success, we want to do something positive, maybe move the user to the dashboard. But if there is nothing like that, or if the type is not success, we want to do something else or just close the modal. So inside this, we make a check for the message modal type. Let's make this a triple equal to be sure. Here we do something as maybe move to the dashboard. After that, we want to close our modal, so we set modal visible to false. That will be outside this if statement because we want to close the modal regardless. Now let's pass these values to the modal at the bottom. So let's cut the comment here so that we have a reference. The first property is the modal visible. And our state is called modal visible as well. Secondly, we have a button handler. And our function is called button handler as well. The next one is the type. And for our state, we called it modal message type. The next one is the header text. And our state is called header text. After this, we have the message. And for our state, we called it modal message. Lastly, we have our button text. Now it looks like we have all the properties that we need, so we can get rid of this comment. If you get a situation like this, you can just minimize and refresh it. Now here's a question. How do we actually get the modal to be displayed when we want with all the appropriate parameters? To do this, we can use a function. So let's create a function and call it show modal. We can do that just above the resend email. This function will build on all the states that we have here to operate. So for a successful operation, we want to take in these values as parameters. So when you want to show the modal, you are required to provide these properties. The first one will be the type of the modal, and then the header text, followed by the message, and then the button text. Inside the function, the first thing we'll do is to set the modal type to the type. So we can copy the function here. Secondly, we set the header text. Thirdly, we set our message. And that will be the message. And also we set our button text. Now the most obvious one is that when you call this show modal function, you actually want to display the modal. So we need to set the modal visible to true. Now let's see a situation where we can make use of the show modal to make the app flow nicer. So we go to our function for handling email verification. Inside the try block, the first thing we want to do is to set verifying to true and not the message. Because actually we don't have any message field here. The value will be true. After that, we want to make a call to the backend. Now after the call, we don't want to move to the next page, but we want to show the modal. So to do that, we first want to set verifying to false since we are done verifying. And then after that, we want to return a call to the show modal function. In this situation, our operation was successful, so the first property, which is the type, will be success. The next property, which is the header text, we can say all good. For our message, we can say your email has been verified. And the last one, which is the button text, we can say proceed. This should do it for the successful part, and we can get rid of the set submitting over here. Now the situation will be a bit similar for when you have an error. So we copy these two statements. And then we can paste it here. The set verifying will stay the same, but for the modal, the type will be filled. And for the heading, we can say filled as well. Also for the message, we can put the message from the error. And for the button text, we can say something like close. Once we do this, we've integrated the modal with our workflow. Now since we didn't use any of the properties here, we can get rid of them for now. So let's quickly enter something into the input field and see if the modal works. Once we press on verify, our modal should be displayed. And when we press outside the modal, it closes. Now when you have the modal and press on the button, we see that nothing happens. That is because we forgot to pass the button handler to the button itself. So let's go back to the message modal and do that. Over here, we need to pass the button handler to the onPress property of the regular button. So we can copy this and paste it here. And now when our modal is displayed, when we click on the button, it should respond as well. Now back on the email verification page, we are all good. So we can go to the top and clear the things we didn't use. This includes the message. And also at the top, we get rid of some of the components. Also, we didn't use the formic, so we can get rid of it. Now we are good for the email verification and we can move to the forgot password.